Welcome to the fourth video in this series covering the fundamentals of screenwriting and storytelling. You can find the full playlist linked in the description or on the end screen of this video.
In screenwriting books and classes, we're told that conflict is an extremely important element of storytelling, but it's rarely explained why this is the case. We're told that conflict drives a story and keeps an audience engaged. But why is conflict actually important? What is its purpose in a story? Today I want to examine these questions and lay out how conflict should be approached when writing a screenplay. Let's begin. First, I want to quickly define conflict. Conflict is a struggle between opposing forces. This struggle is what makes up the events of a story. As a character tries to reach a goal, someone or something is stopping them and they must figure out how to overcome the obstacle. Another way to think about it is that conflict is the problems that exist and the attempts to solve those problems. So a story's plot is simply the character trying to solve the problems in front of them.
And if you solve enough problems, you get to come home.
There are two common types of conflict that most screenwriting books and classes focus on: external conflict and internal conflict. External conflict deals with the obstacles the character faces in the external world. Usually this has to do with the character's goal. The character wants something in the world, but there are forces stopping them from getting it. It's the most simple and straightforward type of conflict. Most films, screenplays, and books will have external conflict. In Dead Poets Society, a group of boys at a preparatory school wants to form a poetry club and read and write poetry together, but they are inhibited by the headmaster and the other professors. In The Shawshank Redemption, Andy Dufresne wants to get out of prison, but the warden, the prison guards, and the prison itself stand in his way. This type of conflict is rarely the most compelling element of the story. However, the external conflict gets the story moving in the right direction. Without external conflict, the character is never placed into situations where he or she struggles with deeper conflict. Dead Poets Society isn't really about just reading and writing poetry. The Shawshank Redemption isn't really about getting out of Shawshank Prison. But these conflicts are necessary so that the audience can understand what the story is really about. The internal conflict has to do with the internal choices the character must make and the emotional attachments the character has. In Dead Poets Society, Neil Perry struggles with his love of acting and his desire to pursue it, and his fear of his father's wrath. In The Shawshank Redemption, Red struggles with his feelings of hopelessness at his long sentence in prison, and Andy's hopeful ideas to make life around him better no matter what. Most bad stories have these two types of conflict. If you look at any movie, it will likely have an external conflict the character must overcome, and there will be some sort of love interest or other relational tie that causes internal conflict and inner choices that have to be made by the main character. But once the character gets the job, gets the money, and gets the love of their life, many times we get to the end and ask, why did I watch that? What was the point of the story? When you get to the end of a film or screenplay and you have this kind of so what feeling, that's usually because the story really didn't have anything to say. Thinking about conflict as simply external and internal is the wrong way to look at stories. To understand why these elements of conflict don't actually help us write great stories, we need to answer an important question. What is the purpose of story? If we can understand the purpose of stories, then we can understand why conflict is such a major part of a great story. In his book Story, Robert McKee writes, "Story is metaphor for life, and to be alive is to be in seemingly perpetual conflict." What McKee is saying is that stories exist to show us examples or metaphors of possible ways to live. One of the biggest continual elements of life is conflict. The human condition is layered with constant conflict. This may be conflict of your beliefs, it could be conflict separating you from external wants, such as a person or possessions, it may be a struggle against the overabundance of comfort, which creates atrophy and weakness. Stories may entertain, inform, or persuade, but ultimately stories exist to show us how to live life within conflict, how others live life within conflict, or to struggle through the deep questions about life. So when you're creating deep conflict in a story, it's not about creating large-scale action sequences or perfectly written dialogue. There's a deeper, more important purpose for conflict. Robert McKee writes, "If I could send a telegram to the film producers of the world, it would be these three words: meaning produces emotion." Michael Arndt, writer of Little Miss Sunshine, Toy Story 3, and other stories, says,
when you're talking about meaning, you're talking about the values that are embedded in your story. So when you're talking about values, you're talking about guides to life, how you live your life, what you think is worth living for, or what you think is worth doing, what you think is not worth doing. So in a weird way, stories are really sort of guides to how you live your life. If stories are about competing values, then they're about competing visions of how you should really live your life.
Meaning is the key to telling a deeply emotional story. Why? Because story is metaphor for life. When a story has a deep meaning, it will make a claim and say this is how life is and how it should be lived, or it will ask us deep questions about our existence. The purpose of story is to give you an understanding of a possible way to live life. Great stories give us a way to learn about life by looking at characters and using them to examine our own lives. Characters in a great story aren't just in conflict because they want to get the job or save the world. They are in conflict because of conflicting values or beliefs. And this brings us to the most important type of conflict, the one that separates truly great stories from mediocre ones. Remember McKee's quote, "Meaning produces emotion." There is one type of conflict that sits above the external and internal conflict, the philosophical or moral conflict. Like human beings, characters move through their worlds with their own sets of values and worldviews. The world in which characters live challenges their values in different ways. This is what creates moral conflict. Other characters believe different things about how to live. As these different characters hold on to their differing worldviews, they are placed into conflict. In his book, The Anatomy of Story, John Truby writes, "Great storytelling isn't just conflict between characters. It's conflict between characters and their values. The external and internal conflict are just extensions of the philosophical conflict. Characters struggle against other characters who hold different worldviews, which creates the external conflict. Characters struggle with what they believe and how their beliefs impact the people they love, which creates the internal conflict." Dead Poets Society focuses around the philosophical struggle between the values of tradition, rules, and structure versus the values of free thinking, of challenging the status quo, and challenging conformity. Dead Poets Society brings up questions like, should tradition be followed simply for tradition's sake? Should people learn to think for themselves or focus on being a productive part of the group? When does something go from daring and adventurous to just plain stupid? The Shawshank Redemption focuses around the philosophical struggle between hope in the midst of difficult surroundings versus despair and acceptance of the status quo. The Shawshank Redemption forces us to think about how we can fight against external chaos and despair and do what we can to keep moving forward and make our lives as good as possible with what we're given. The film also deals with the value of having a long-term goal that instills hope as we move towards that goal. This philosophical struggle between different systems of values is what truly engages us with the different characters. Their external goals and internal conflicts come out of their personal belief systems rather than being arbitrarily created to serve the plot. But how do these films actually wrestle with these different ideas and worldviews? They do it by giving characters different worldviews or value systems that place them in conflict with the other characters. When a story uses different characters to stand as different points of view in a philosophical conflict, meaning and depth is given to the story and to each scene. I won't be looking at every single character in each of these stories, just enough to give an understanding of the way these stories use a web of characters to create philosophical conflict. In The Shawshank Redemption, Andy Dufresne is the one who maintains hope even in dark circumstances. Even though he's put into prison for a crime he didn't commit, he focuses on making the prison a more human place. Red is constantly pulled between Andy's ideas of hope and the things that he's seen inside the prison all these years. He wants to be hopeful, but he struggles to embody it like Andy. Boggs' diamond is an obstacle against the inner hope that Andy holds. Boggs makes life for Andy a living hell through beating him again and again, and this challenges Andy's beliefs about maintaining hope. Brooks Hatlin is a man who gets to a completely hopeless place. He is finally released from prison into a world he no longer understands. He feels like he's lost everything, and he gets to the point of complete and utter hopelessness. Brooks is a major character that challenges Red's beliefs. Red fears that he will be just as hopeless as Brooks on the outside. Warden Norton is the biggest antagonist to the hope Andy holds. He has control over the prison and over the lives of the prisoners. Norton doesn't just want the prisoners to serve their terms, he actually works to make their lives worse. Byron Hadley is an extension of Warden Norton. He carries out the hopelessness that stems from the warden by abusing his powers as a prison guard. Tommy Williams is a symbol of hope for Andy. Andy helps to instill hope and goals within Tommy, but just as it seems like Tommy will get free and have his life change for the better, the warden crushes this hope by killing Tommy. In Dead Poets Society, Mr. Gale Nolan is the headmaster of the school and the absolute embodiment of tradition. This is explicitly laid out in the very beginning of the film.
Tradition, honor, discipline, excellence.
John Keating is the new English and literature teacher to Welton, who instills a desire in his students to challenge the status quo and to think for themselves.
Carpe diem, that's to seize the day.
He teaches in a way that goes against the traditional viewpoints of the rest of the school. Todd Anderson is an introverted new student. While he is slow to adopt the ideas of Mr. Keating, his inner poet is pulled out by Keating. Todd and Neil Perry become the ones who embody the ideas of Keating most deeply. Neil Perry wants to follow the ideas of Mr. Keating, yet struggles against his father. While Neil wants to take control of his own life and become an actor, Mr. Perry wants Neil to become a doctor, a safer and more traditional career. Mr. Perry is extremely traditionalist and wants Neil to follow the specific plan laid out in front of him. Mr. Perry didn't have the same opportunities as Neil and doesn't want Neil to waste his life on what he believes are fleeting dreams. Charlie Dalton takes the Carpe Diem message to the point of recklessness and gets softly reprimanded by Keating. Keating says there's a difference between being daring and stupid, and that it's an important difference to know. Charlie shows that there are limits to the ideas that Keating is teaching. Knox Overstreet takes a hopeful leap and pursues a relationship with Chris Noel. His daring acts pay off, and through the course of the film, Chris begins to fall for him. Richard Cameron is the only boy in the group who prefers the more traditional viewpoints of Mr. Nolan over Keating. He isn't convinced of Mr. Keating and believes sticking to tradition may be better for them in the long run. I realize I didn't go through every single character in these films. While the more peripheral characters have less of an impact on the philosophical conflict of the story, they still stand as a point of conflict that challenges or affirms what the main characters believe. The characters in these films don't just exist to make the world more interesting, and they don't simply exist to be allies or to simply create roadblocks for the main character. Their purpose in the story is deeper than that. Each of the characters push the other characters and the audience deeper into the philosophical conflict at the core of the film. The philosophical conflict at the center is what gives the story its meaning. The characters' internal struggles and external plot may be interesting, but it is only engaging because of the deeper conflict happening on the philosophical level. Writing teachers might tell you that you need conflict in every scene, and while you do need conflict in your scenes, this type of advice is missing the point of how stories actually work and what makes them great. Sure, scenes need conflict, but what kind? A story filled with simple external conflict in every scene will be unengaging. All of the external and internal conflict exists under the umbrella of the ultimate conflict, which is the philosophical or moral conflict. This doesn't necessarily mean you have to create this extremely obvious battle between competing values, but a great story will have this deep conflict of values if you take a closer look. You might ask, doesn't this cause stories to be preachy or bash you over the head with a worldview? No. Bad writing causes preachy films. All great films preach at you in the sense that they deal with philosophical conflict. You just may not realize it at the time. Write stories with deep meaning. Find the meaning in the deep conflict between differing philosophies and worldviews. That is the purpose of story, and that is the purpose of conflict.
So now that you understand the purpose of conflict, how do you actually create it in a story? And what are the best ways to intentionally build conflict in your screenplay? Next week, I'll be taking a look at how to create story conflict and how it actually works in a story. So be sure to check out the other videos in this series by clicking the playlist now. And if you like this video, leave a like and subscribe for more videos just like this one.